One of the more colorful urban myths of the criminal justice system is the so-called Twinkie defense. It is alleged that a San Francisco jury of middle-class homeowners gave Supervisor Dan White, who killed another supervisor, Harvey Milk, and San Francisco's mayor, George Moscone, he committed a double homicide because he was eating junk food like Twinkies. And because of that, they gave him a partial pass. Rather than convicting him of first-degree murder, they convicted him only of manslaughter. So that was the Twinkie defense. If you eat junk food and then kill somebody, the jury will be, at least in part, forgiving. And rather than convicting you of first-degree murder, will convict you of a far lesser offense. And certainly Dan White was convicted of a far lesser offense. I believe it was voluntary manslaughter, and he served 4, 5, maybe 6 years in prison. And this simply didn't happen. What happened was that Dan White, or his attorneys, presented a traditional mental defense. And mental defense is an explanation to a jury of why somebody would commit a heinous act. And clearly you needed one where Dan White was concerned, because he killed 2 people, and of course this is a terrible thing, and he destroyed the families of those 2 people, and he destroyed his own life. So you have to ask, why would a rational man, he was a San Francisco supervisor, this is a legislator, a city legislator, he had been a fireman, he had been a San Francisco policeman, he then ran for political office, a very conservative man, a Catholic, a pillar of the community, if you will. How could a pillar of the community do such a terrible thing to these 2 worthy men, to say nothing of, incidentally, doing a terrible thing to his own family, who now have to embrace this killer? So the only explanation has to be a mental defense. There was something wrong with this man, and clearly it would be something much more wrong than a poor choice of diet. And it is true that when Dan White went off the deep end, one of the signs of that would be his predilection for junk food. But typically when a person who's an upright, moral citizen who's never broken the law before breaks the law in some horrendous, gratuitous way, it's usually because something snapped, something went wrong in here, usually as a consequence of a confluence of factors. It's sort of like when an airliner crashes. If a 747 crashes, it isn't because one thing went wrong. There's such a redundancy built into our air transport system that for a commercial airliner to come down, usually you have to have 3 or 4 bad things happening at the same time. The instrument panel is shorted out. The pilot doesn't speak good English in his communication with the control tower. The weather is terrible. Maybe some other factors. But you need all these factors in order to bring a plane down. And so it is, you often need a bunch of bad things happening to someone that they snap to the point where they take a life. Assuming they're not a bad person to begin with. Obviously there are psychopaths out there who will kill you for $10. But this is, as I say, a family man, a devout Catholic, a respected supervisor, a former policeman, former fireman. And what you have is a man who, underneath that strength, it was a sort of a brittle strength, and like cast iron is strong but brittle. You can snap it if you hit it the right way. This was a man who had a lot of tremendous conflicts. He saw a lot of things wrong with the world and ran for office because he wanted to correct those things from a conservative point of view. And here he's running for office in a liberal town and serving on a city council as a supervisor where he's regularly outvoted. And this is very frustrating to him. He represented to his constituents, he would make a difference. But he tended to be the lone conservative voice on a very liberal council, so that was frustrating. His income fell. He had been a fireman and thought he could be a fireman and also be a supervisor, and they said, no, it's a conflict of interest because you're voting on your own firehouse budget, so you have to give up your job. He loses his income at the very same time that his wife becomes pregnant, and so it's limited to how much he can go out and work. So what they do is they open up a little fast food franchise, and he covers it part of the time and she covers it part of the time, but they hardly ever meet anymore because either she's working or he's working. So he has financial problems. All in the service of serving the community, which he can do less and less because he's always outvoted. And he becomes ever so frustrated by his inability to make a difference. His financial problems are pressing on him. And he decides he can't handle the stress anymore. And he tells Mayor George Moscone he's resigning. And he has about 6 hours of relief. And then he starts getting the phone calls about being a quitter. And you're the only man we can count on in there, and you're quitting, and you're being selfish. And that apparently triggers his Catholic guilt, and he goes back to Moscone. He says, I withdraw my resignation. But you can't really do that. And by this time, of course, Moscone and the powers that be are thinking of appointing somebody more politically congenial to take his place. And so Moscone says, well, I'm not sure we can do that. You're going to have a lot of support to persuade me to be able to do that. So already now feeling stressed out, this supervisor, Dan White, has to go out and try and get support to get himself reappointed. And a lot of people that used to vote for him are disillusioned, and he's having trouble getting that support. And Moscone decides that he's not going to reappoint him. Now, as all of these stresses, the pregnancy, running into the red financially, letting his constituents down, being called a coward and a quitter, all these frustrations now are taking their toll on this guy. And when Dan White is under the gun, typically he would get depressed, and when he got depressed he would give up his healthy life. He used to be a runner and eat the right things, and he would stop running and just lie on the couch all day, abandoning his healthy diet in favor of junk food, which yes included Twinkies and Coca-Cola and all that sort of thing. And the more he would eat this junk food and avoid exercise, the more depressed he got. The more depressed he got, the more he would tend to eat the wrong things and forego exercise, including sexual contact with his wife. And the smaller his life became, the more depressed he became, and the more depressed, the more withdrawn he became. So he's going down in a downward spiral. And it was in this state of hopelessness and frustration and despair that he goes to City Hall one day to try and talk his way back. By the way, as an ex-cop, he always carries a gun, so nothing special about that. But when Moscone said, I'm not going to reappoint you, that was the final snap for him. He had no place to go. Now, I'm not justifying his killing 2 people. By the way, I used to be a liberal politician myself. I was mayor of my hometown, San Anselmo. I knew George personally. I didn't know Harvey Milk, the gay supervisor who White also killed, but they were my people, not Dan White. But when I examined Dan White as a forensic psychiatrist, I was bound by my clinical ethics to explain to the jury all of the factors that would lead White to do what he did, without excusing it, but explaining it. And there were some other pressures as well. The bottom line is that the jury got to see White not just as a killer, but as a human being. They could say, to some extent, there but for the grace of God go I. And to the extent that juries are able to empathize with a criminal defendant, they are proportionately forgiving. So they didn't give him a pass, but they certainly were willing to convict him of a lesser crime, and that's why they convicted him of a manslaughter. And they certainly did not do so because he ate junk food. They did so because they recognized that this guy was operating as much out of madness as badness. And as I say, empathy is proportionate to a jury's relative forgiveness. And so, Dan White was convicted of manslaughter, and this obviously was a better outcome from his perspective than being convicted of murder, but he still went off to prison, continued to be very depressed, and 2 months after he was served the sentence and was back home, he went to his garage and hung himself. So he was a hugely imperfect and psychiatrically disabled man, and did the terrible thing he did out of a psychiatric disability. The jury at some level recognized this and recognized the complexity of this disability. Somehow, this got turned around to the Twinkie defense. Now, if you read the daily papers, if you go back to the archives and read the daily papers that covered the trial, they did a good job at covering the mental defense and its complexities. It was occupied a week of trial. Or if you somehow could replay the videos of the channel news broadcasts, again, you get a sense of the complexity of this mental defense. But Newsweek, as I recall, which had to cover all of this stuff in just a short column, they compressed all of this under the rubric Twinkie defense, and that name stuck. You certainly don't get any sense of that in the comprehensive day-to-day coverage of the trial. I'll say one more thing. I'm not suggesting that what you eat is utterly without impact on your psyche. Of course it is. We are what we eat. And there are plenty of studies which show that if you eat a lot of junk food, it's going to affect your mood. It's not going to cause you to go out and kill 2 people. I've already tried to talk about Dan White's special proclivity for that. But it certainly will impair your ability to channel your despair in more productive ways. And the studies continue to come out showing that, at least in those people who are genetically predisposed, large quantities of junk food can be quite destabilizing. So there's something to be said for that. But that's miles and miles from suggesting that I or any other psychiatrist testifying on Dan White's behalf testify that he killed 2 people because he ate Twinkies. Never happened.